Lawyer proves point. Clement Vallandigham was a lawyer, a politician, and one of the most prominent legal minds in Ohio. On the evening of June 16, 1871, he was in his room at the Golden Lamb Hotel in Lebanon, Ohio, preparing the most important argument of a murder trial. Vallandigham had spent years building a reputation. He had served in the United States House of Representatives. He had run for governor of Ohio. He had been arrested during the Civil War for speaking against the Union war effort, deported to the Confederacy, and had still managed to return to American soil and resume his legal career. By 1871, he was considered a formidable presence in any courtroom, a man who understood how to construct an argument and how to make a jury believe it. The case before him involved a man named Thomas McGeehan. McGeehan stood accused of murder in connection with a barroom brawl in which another man, Tom Myers, had been shot and killed. The prosecution's position was that McGeehan had pulled a pistol and fired it deliberately. Vallandigham's defense rested on a different theory entirely. He intended to argue that Myers had shot himself accidentally, that in the chaos and close quarters of a saloon fight, a man reaching for his own weapon could have discharged it into his own body without intending to. It was not an implausible argument. Barroom brawls of the era were fast, close, and unpredictable. Pistols of the period required deliberate motion to draw and fire, but in a struggle, that motion could be unintentional. Vallandigham believed the scenario was physically possible, and he intended to demonstrate it to his colleagues that evening, to prepare for the following day in court. He gathered members of the defense team in his hotel room. He wanted to walk through the precise mechanics of how a man could draw a pistol from his pocket and accidentally discharge it in the process of doing so. He reached for a pistol that had been collected as part of the case materials. He believed the weapon was unloaded. It was not. Vallandigham took hold of the pistol and positioned himself to replicate what he argued had happened to Tom Myers. He drew the weapon from his pocket in the manner he planned to describe to the jury. The gun discharged. The bullet entered his abdomen. The men in the room were witnesses to the immediate aftermath. Vallandigham had demonstrated exactly what he had set out to demonstrate. The scenario he had constructed, a man accidentally shooting himself while drawing a pistol, was physically plausible. He had just proven it. Medical attention was summoned to the hotel. The wound to his abdomen was assessed by physicians who arrived at the scene. Abdominal gunshot wounds in 1871 were not survivable with any consistency. The tools and techniques available to surgeons of the period were limited. Infection was near certain. Internal bleeding could not be controlled with the precision that later medicine would develop. Vallandigham received what care was possible, but the nature of the wound left little room for recovery. He survived through the night. His condition did not improve. The following morning, on June 17, 1871, Clement Vallandigham died from the gunshot wound he had inflicted upon himself. In the course of building his legal defense, Thomas McGeehan was acquitted. The jury, presented with a defense theory that had just been fatally validated by the very man who argued it, found reasonable doubt in the case against him. Newspapers of the period covered the trial's outcome at length, noting the peculiar circumstance of a defense attorney dying in service of the argument that ultimately freed his client, a detail that outlived the trial itself in the region's legal folklore. Window frame fails. Gary Hoy was 38 years old and a senior partner at the Toronto law firm Holden Day Wilson. On July 9, 1993, he was at the office on the 24th floor of the Toronto Dominion Centre, one of the most recognized commercial towers in the city, showing a group of articling students around the building. Hoy had a particular demonstration he liked to perform. The windows of the Toronto Dominion Centre were constructed to be strong. They were designed to withstand significant force. Hoy knew this, and he had made a habit of proving it in a manner that left an impression on young lawyers visiting the firm. He would walk up to the floor-to-ceiling glass panels and throw himself against them with his body, bouncing off and walking away unharmed. He had done this before, more than once, possibly on many separate occasions, with different groups of students over the course of his time at the firm. The glass had never broken. The stunt had always worked. The 24th floor offered an unobstructed view of the city below. The building itself was a landmark of Toronto's financial district, a tower of steel and dark glass that dominated the downtown skyline. The windows on that floor were large, floor-to-ceiling panels set into frames that separated the interior of the building from the open air 24 stories above street level. On this particular afternoon, Hoy gathered the articling students and positioned himself near one of the windows. He intended to make his usual point about the construction quality of the building. He ran at the glass and threw himself against it. The glass did not break. The window frame separated from the wall. The entire assembly, frame and glass together, gave way under the force of the impact. The panel that Hoy had launched himself against held together as a unit, but the structure anchoring it to the building did not. Hoy passed through the opening left behind and fell 24 stories to the courtyard below. The students on the 24th floor witnessed what had just occurred. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Responders arrived at the courtyard and assessed the scene. The fall from 24 stories was not survivable. Hoy was found at the base of the building and was pronounced dead at the scene. The Law Society of Upper Canada confirmed the details of the incident. The Holden Day Wilson firm acknowledged the circumstances. In 1993, the incident was recognized by the Darwin Awards, an informal designation for fatal accidents involving an unusual relationship between the victim's actions and the outcome. Engineers who later reviewed the incident noted that the glass itself had performed exactly as designed, withstanding the impact without so much as cracking, and that the failure point had always been the silicone sealant and mounting system holding the frame to the surrounding wall, a component that had never been tested against the specific repeated stress of a full-grown man throwing himself into it. The glass had not broken, the frame had. Gary Hoy was pronounced dead on July 9, 1993. Cause of death: impact from a fall of 24 stories. Beard on stairs. Hans Steininger was the mayor of Braunau am Inn, a market town in what is now Austria, and he was known throughout the region for one thing above all others. His beard measured approximately 4.5 feet in length, or roughly 1.4 meters. It was, by the records of the period, among the longest beards documented on any living man in 16th century Europe. Steininger was not careless with his beard. He understood that a beard of that length presented practical difficulties in daily life, and he had developed a routine for managing it. He kept the beard rolled up and secured in a leather pouch, tucked away so that it would not drag on the ground or catch on anything as he moved through his day. The pouch was a deliberate piece of equipment, something he carried specifically to keep the beard contained. When secured, the beard presented no hazard. It was only when it was loose that its length became significant. In 1567, a fire broke out in Braunau am Inn. The accounts of the incident do not specify the exact date, but the year is documented in the historical record. The fire spread through the town and created conditions of urgency and alarm. Residents moved quickly to evacuate, to respond, or to escape the area of the blaze. Steininger, as mayor, would have had reason to move through the town at speed. In the rush to flee, Steininger did not fasten his beard into its pouch. He descended a staircase with the beard loose and trailing behind him. The exact location of the staircase is not confirmed in the available historical record. What is confirmed is what happened on it. Steininger stepped on the trailing end of his own beard mid-descent. The sudden check on the beard's movement pulled against him as he stepped forward. He lost his footing and fell. The fall broke his neck. Medical intervention for a broken neck in 1567 was not a category that meaningfully existed. The injury was fatal. Hans Steininger, mayor of Braunau am Inn, died as a result of the fall on that staircase. Whether death came immediately or shortly after the fall is not uniformly confirmed in the sources available. What is confirmed is that he did not survive the injury. His beard was preserved following his death. It is currently on display at the Heimathaus Museum in Braunau am Inn, where it has remained as a documented artifact of the incident and of the man who carried it, alongside the leather pouch he had used for years to keep it safely out of his own way. Local accounts of the town's history still reference the incident today, and Steininger's death is sometimes cited in regional folklore as an early cautionary tale about the risks of habit and routine breaking down under sudden emergency conditions. Scarf at speed. Isadora Duncan was 50 years old and one of the most recognizable figures in the world of performance and dance. On September 14, 1927, she was in Niort, France, preparing to leave for the evening in an open-air automobile. Duncan had built her career on movement and on aesthetic. She was known across Europe and the United States for her performances, for her unconventional approach to dance, and for the dramatic, flowing garments she wore both on and off the stage. Fabric and movement were central to her public identity. Long scarves, loose garments, and trailing cloth were not occasional accessories for Duncan. They were part of how she presented herself to the world. Nice in September was a city in the warmth of the Mediterranean late summer. The Promenade des Anglais ran along the coast, and the streets of the city were populated with the vehicles and pedestrians of an active evening. Duncan was preparing to go for a ride in an open-topped automobile. The car was a small, open-air vehicle, the make of which is disputed across historical sources, with some accounts identifying it as an Emil car, and others describing a different model entirely. What all accounts agree on is that the car was open, that the wheels and drive components were exposed, and that Duncan wore a long silk scarf that evening. She climbed into the passenger seat. The scarf was long and trailing. It extended behind her as she settled into the vehicle. The The car pulled away from the curb. The trailing end of the scarf dropped or drifted toward the rear of the vehicle as it moved. It made a contact with the spokes of the rear wheel. The spinning wheel caught the fabric. The scarf wrapped around the spoke-wheeled rear rim and axle of the open-air sports car in the same motion. The force applied to Duncan's neck was instantaneous. The scarf, now fixed to a rotating axle, had no slack left to give. The jerk to her neck was immediate and severe. Bystanders on the street observed the incident as it unfolded. Duncan was pulled or thrown by the force of the entanglement. The car stopped. Those present moved to assist her. The injury to her neck was assessed at the scene by whoever arrived first among the bystanders and responders. The injury was not survivable. Isadora Duncan died at the scene or within moments of the incident. The cause of death was a broken neck, caused by the sudden and forceful engagement of her scarf with the vehicle's rear wheel and axle. She was 50 years old. The date was September 14th, 1927. Friends who had seen her off that evening later recalled that as she settled into the car and arranged the scarf around her neck, she called out a line to those watching that has since been repeated in nearly every account of her death, a remark about going to glory that took on an unintended weight within seconds of the car pulling away. Molasses Wave, Boston. On January 15th, 1919, at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, a steel storage tank belonging to the Purity Distilling Company burst open on Commercial Street in the North End neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. What followed was one of the most unusual industrial disasters in American history. The North End in 1919 was a dense working-class neighborhood on the waterfront edge of the city. Commercial Street ran along the harbor and supported a mix of industrial operations, freight handling, and residential buildings packed closely together. The area around the Purity Distilling Company tank was not empty at midday. Workers, residents, and passers-by occupied the street and the surrounding blocks. The tank itself was enormous. It stood approximately 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, and it held 2.3 million gallons of molasses. The substance inside was intended for industrial fermentation, part of the production chain for industrial alcohol. The tank had been filled repeatedly over its years of use. There were reports, documented later in the legal proceedings that followed, that the tank had shown signs of structural weakness. Residents of the neighborhood had noticed the tank leaking. The company had addressed complaints about the seepage by painting the tank brown so the drips would be less visible. At approximately 12:30, the tank failed. The steel walls gave way along the lower portion of the structure. The force of 2.3 million gallons releasing at once was not a slow leak. It was a rupture. The wave that came out of the tank was estimated at between 15 and 25 feet high. It moved at an estimated 35 miles per hour down Commercial Street. The wave hit everything in its path. Buildings along the street were struck and partially collapsed. An elevated railway structure nearby was damaged. Freight cars were overturned. Horses caught in the wave were unable to move. People on the street had no meaningful time to respond to something moving at 35 miles per hour. Molasses at the temperature and viscosity present in that tank was not water. It was dense and adhesive. Those caught in it found movement extremely difficult. The substance settled around and over people who fell in it, compressing against the chest and restricting breathing. Others were struck by structural debris carried along in the wave or were hit by the wave itself with enough force to cause fatal blunt trauma. Rescue workers began arriving at the scene as the wave settled. Police officers, firefighters, and Red Cross volunteers all responded. The scene they found was difficult to navigate. The molasses covered the street and surrounding areas in a layer that made movement slow and treacherous. Locating victims within the substance required searching through a surface that resisted movement and obscured what lay beneath. 21 people were killed. 150 more were injured. The recovery of victims extended across hours and into the following days as the scope of the disaster became fully apparent. A class action lawsuit was filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the parent organization of Purity Distilling. The case was heard over years of proceedings. In 1925, a state-appointed auditor found the company liable, and the parent company was ordered to pay damages in a landmark ruling. The legal findings identified structural negligence as a contributing factor in the tank's failure. Investigators determined that the steel used in the tank's construction had been too thin for its size, and that the company had never conducted a proper pressure test after filling it to capacity. Choices later cited as key factors in one of the first major cases to establish stricter engineering oversight requirements for large industrial storage structures in the United States. 21 people died on Commercial Street in Boston on January 15, 1919. Cause of death: drowning, suffocation, and blunt force trauma from a wave of 2.3 million gallons of molasses moving at 35 miles per hour. Bottle cap inhaled. Tennessee Williams was 71 years old and had written some of the most performed plays in the American theatrical canon. On February 25, 1983, He was found dead in his room at the Hotel Elysée in Manhattan, New York. Williams had lived at the Hotel Elysée on East 54th Street for extended periods during his later years. The hotel was a fixture of his life in New York, a place he returned to and used as a base when he was in the city. By 1983, he was in his 8th decade, a figure whose career stretched back to the 1940s and whose work, including a streetcar named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, had earned him 2 Pulitzer Prizes and a permanent place in American literary history. Williams had a habit. It was a small, unremarkable habit, the kind of routine that develops around a repeated physical task. When applying drops to his eyes or nose, he would place the small plastic cap from the bottle in his mouth to keep his hands free. It was a practical solution to a minor inconvenience. He had done it regularly enough that it had become automatic. The exact type of bottle is disputed in the available sources. Some accounts identify it as an eye drop bottle. Others describe it as a nasal spray bottle. What is consistent across the accounts is the size of the cap involved and the mechanism of what occurred. On the evening of February 24th or the morning of February 25th, Williams was alone in his hotel room. He tilted his head back in the manner required to apply the drops. The plastic cap, which he had placed in his mouth in the usual way, shifted position. He inhaled. The cap was drawn into his airway. No one was present in the room. There was no one to perform any intervention. Williams was found in his room. The time at which he was discovered is not consistently documented across available sources. The condition in which he was found was consistent with asphyxiation. The medical examiner who examined the body determined the cause of death and identified the bottle cap as the obstruction responsible. The finding was asphyxiation caused by inhalation of the plastic bottle cap. Some biographers and medical commentators have since questioned whether long-term substance use, well documented in accounts of his later life, may have contributed to reduced reflexes that night, though the official cause of death recorded by the medical examiner remained the airway obstruction itself. Tennessee Williams was pronounced dead on February 25, 1983. He was 71 years old. Eagle drops Tortoise. According to classical historical accounts recorded by the Roman author Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, and separately by the writer Valerius Maximus, the Greek playwright Aeschylus was killed around 456 before the Common Era in the town of Gela, on the southern coast of Sicily. Aeschylus was, by the time of his death, the foundational figure of Greek tragic drama. He had written dozens of plays, of which 7 survive, including the Oresteia trilogy, a sequence of 3 tragedies that addressed murder, justice, and the resolution of ancient blood feuds through the institution of law. He had competed in dramatic festivals in Athens, won numerous times, and achieved a level of recognition that placed him at the top of his art form. At the time of his death, he was likely in his late 60s. He was in Gela, a Greek colonial city on the southern shore of Sicily. The accounts do not specify what brought him there. The city was established and functional, a part of the broader Greek world that extended across the Mediterranean. The landscape of southern Sicily in the 5th century before the Common Era was open with clear skies above the coastal terrain. What the classical sources record is this: a bird, identified in some accounts as an eagle and in others as a lammergeier, which is a large bearded vulture known to carry shelled prey to altitude and drop it onto rocks to crack it open, was carrying a tortoise in flight above the area. Aeschylus was outdoors and bald. The bird, according to Pliny the Elder's account, identified the bald head of Aeschylus from altitude and mistook it for a smooth stone suitable for cracking the tortoise's shell. The bird released the tortoise. The animal struck Aeschylus on the head. The classical sources do not record a detailed medical response. They record the outcome. The blow to the skull from a falling tortoise dropped from the height at which such birds carry prey was, according to the accounts, fatal. Some later ancient writers also claimed Aeschylus had received an oracle warning him that he would die from something falling from the sky, and that he had spent his final days deliberately staying outdoors in open country, specifically to avoid the collapse of any building. A detail that, if accurate, would make the manner of his death an almost exact fulfillment of the very danger he thought he had successfully avoided. These accounts originate entirely from ancient written sources, and cannot be verified by modern evidentiary standards. Pliny the Elder and Valerius Maximus were writing centuries after the events they described, drawing on earlier accounts that no longer survive in their original form. The incident is presented here as it appears in the classical historical record, not as a verified modern fact. As recorded by Pliny the Elder, Aeschylus died at Gela, Sicily, around 456 before the Common Era, killed by a tortoise dropped from altitude by a bird that had mistaken his bald head for a rock. Robot Strike, Michigan. Robert Williams was 25 years old and worked on the factory floor of the Ford Motor Company's casting plant in Flat Rock, Michigan. On January 25, 1979, he became the first documented human being killed by an industrial robot. The Flat Rock casting plant was an operational manufacturing facility. The work performed there involved the production and handling of cast metal parts. The plant, like other Ford facilities of the period, used automated systems to assist with parts retrieval and movement. One such system was a mechanical transfer arm, a piece of equipment designed to move through a programmed cycle to retrieve parts from a multi-level storage rack and bring them to where they were needed on the floor. The automated retrieval system was, on the day of January 25, 1979, running behind. The pace of the system's operation was not matching the pace of demand on the production floor. Workers on the floor were operating in an environment where the automated system was a present but underperforming part of the workflow. Williams made a decision to enter the multi-level storage rack himself. The rack was the area the mechanical arm was designed to service. By climbing into it, Williams could retrieve the parts manually and move the work forward without waiting for the automated system to complete its cycle. The mechanical transfer arm did not know he was there. The arm continued its programmed retrieval cycle. It moved through the storage rack along its designated path. Williams was within that path. The arm, which weighed approximately 1 ton, struck Williams from behind. The blow was to his head. He died at the scene. Co-workers on the floor discovered what had happened. Emergency services were contacted and responded to the plant. The injury from the impact of a 1-ton mechanical arm was assessed by the responders who arrived. The damage was not survivable. No resuscitation attempts succeeded. The incident was documented by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It entered the formal record of industrial accident investigation and became a foundational case in the developing field of robotic safety. The circumstances of the incident raised immediate questions about how automated systems should detect and respond to the presence of human workers within their operating range. Safety engineers writing in the years that followed frequently cited the case as the starting point for what eventually became formal industry standards, requiring physical barriers, light curtains, and automatic shutoff systems anywhere a human worker might share space with an active industrial robot. Williams's family filed a lawsuit against Litton Industries, the manufacturer of the robot arm responsible for the incident. The case was heard and decided in favor of the family. The jury awarded $10 million in the verdict against Litton Industries. Robert Williams was pronounced dead on January 25, 1979. Cause of death: blunt force trauma from a mechanical robot arm at the Ford Motor Company casting plant in Flat Rock, Michigan. He was 25 years old. Conductor stabs foot. Jean-Baptiste Lully was 54 years old and held the position of royal composer to King Louis XIV of France. On January 8, 1687, he was conducting a performance of his composition Te Deum at the Church of the Feuillants in Paris. The performance had been commissioned to celebrate the king's recovery from a serious illness. It was a prestigious occasion, and Lully's role at its center reflected his standing at the French court. Lully had dominated musical life at Versailles for decades. He had composed operas, ballets, and ceremonial works that defined the sound of the French court. His access to the king and his control over royal musical appointments made him one of the most powerful figures in French cultural life. He was also known as a forceful and physically expressive conductor, a man who directed with authority and intensity. In 1687, orchestral conductors did not use the slim batons that became standard in later centuries. The method of the period involved a long, heavy staff pointed at one end, which the conductor struck against the wooden floor to mark time for the musicians. The staff was not a decorative prop. It was a functional tool, used with force to produce an audible beat that could be heard across the ensemble. Lully was conducting the Te Deum with the full intensity that the occasion demanded. The church was the setting for a royal celebration. The performance was significant. In the course of conducting, Lully brought the staff down and missed the floor. The pointed end of the staff drove into his own foot. The wound was immediate and significant. The performance, the details of its continuation or interruption are not uniformly confirmed in the historical sources. Concluded, Lully received treatment for the wound to his foot. Physicians assessed the injury. The wound did not heal cleanly. In the days that followed, the tissue around the point of impact began to deteriorate. Gangrene developed in the foot. The physicians attending Lully recommended amputation of the affected toe. Lully refused. The gangrene progressed. The recommendation was then made to amputate the foot. Lully refused again. Whether his refusal was connected to his identity as a dancer, a role he had performed earlier in his career, is noted in some historical accounts, but is not confirmed in terms of the specific reasoning he gave at the time of refusal, and that reasoning is not reproduced here. The infection spread from the foot into the rest of his body over the weeks that followed. The gangrene moved beyond what the wound site alone represented. His condition deteriorated across February and into March of 1687. Jean-Baptiste Lully died on March 22, 1687. The cause of death was systemic gangrene resulting from an untreated wound to the foot, following his refusal to undergo amputation. He was 54 years old. Brothers buried alive. Homer Collier and his brother Langley Collier had lived as recluses in their family home at 2078 Fifth Avenue in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City for decades. By 1947, their home and the manner in which they had filled it had become a subject of significant public and official attention. On March 21st, 1947, police responded to a report and entered the building. What they found inside marked the conclusion of one of the most extensively documented cases of compulsive hoarding in American history. The Collier brothers had grown up in the Fifth Avenue house in a family of some social standing. Their father had been a physician. Both brothers had attended Columbia University. Homer had practiced law. Langley had worked as a piano dealer and engineer. Over time, the brothers had withdrawn from the city around them. They disconnected their utilities. They ceased contact with most of the outside world. They remained in the house with what they were accumulating. The accumulation was vast. Over decades, Langley had brought into the house an estimated 140 tons of material. Newspapers filled rooms from floor to ceiling. There were car parts, musical instruments, baby carriages, folding chairs, boxes of every description, chandeliers, medical equipment, and masses of other objects packed into every available space. The newspapers were kept specifically because Langley believed Homer, who had gone blind and become paralyzed, would recover his sight someday and would want to catch up on what he had missed. Langley had constructed a system of tunnels through the debris so that he could move through the house. He had also built booby traps throughout the tunnel network. The traps were designed to collapse portions of the accumulated debris onto intruders, deterring anyone who might try to enter the house to rob or harm them. He maintained these traps deliberately, knowing where they were and navigating around them as he moved through the building to care for Homer. Homer was entirely dependent on Langley. He could not move independently. He could not feed himself. He could not exit the building or call for help. His survival depended entirely on Langley's continued ability to reach him. At some point in March of 1947, Langley was moving through one of his tunnels. The available evidence established by investigators who worked through the building afterward indicates that he was likely making his way toward Homer to bring him food. While crawling through the tunnel, Langley triggered one of his own booby traps. The debris above and around him collapsed. He was buried under the material and crushed. He could not free himself and could not call for help in any way that would be heard. Homer, in an adjacent area of the building, had no means of knowing what had happened. He had no ability to move toward his brother or to exit the building. He had no way to summon help. Police received a report of a dead body in the house on March 21st, 1947. Officers entered the building and located Homer's body. He had died of starvation. The search for Langley began immediately, but locating him within the debris required physically removing material from the building. Officers and workers began the process of clearing the house. The removal of the accumulated material took weeks. Workers extracted over 100 tons of debris from the building. Langley's body was found approximately 3 weeks after Homer's, buried under the collapsed debris approximately 10 feet from where Homer had died. The cause of Langley's death was identified as asphyxiation from the collapse of his own booby trap. The exact date of Langley's death is not known. Only the date his body was found is part of the confirmed record. The house itself was later condemned and demolished, and the site where it once stood on Fifth Avenue is now a small public park named after the brothers. A quiet green space that gives no outward indication of what was found inside the building that had occupied the lot for over 60 years. Homer Collier died of starvation. Langley Collier died of asphyxiation from the collapse of a debris trap he had constructed himself. Both deaths were confirmed in the spring of 1947. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.